name's Jeff Foresman. I tend to speak loud anyways. I am from Rook Security. We're an information security company out of Indianapolis. Really enjoyed being down here today with you guys. And I'm here to talk about, are you really PCI compliant? And to take a look at common PCI DSS failures. To give you a little bit of background, I started working with the early CIS requirements from Visa, which turned into being the PCI requirements. In about 2005, I ran Verizon Business's PCI practice for about 5 years. And then I actually joined the PCI Council. I was their first in-house trainer. Trained about 2,000 QSAs, and then went back in the field to do auditing. And had the pleasure of failing almost every major retailer there is. I enjoyed it, they didn't so much. But what I really wanted to do today is, rather than talk about the requirements like everyone does, and you go to sleep, especially after lunch and cookies and all of that, I wanted to talk about why I see organizations fail. So I'm going to jump in. I've got a fair amount of content here. I want to just level set real quickly. We'll talk about PCI DSS Basics, and then we'll dive right into what are the common problems that we've seen out there, and how do you solve those common problems. So the basics. The PCI SSC is the PCI Security Standards Council. They're the ones that actually develop and publish the various PCI standards, and I'll give you a quick overview of what those different standards are. The council itself is made up of the 5 founding global payment brands out there: American Express, Discover, JCB, MasterCard, and Visa. They are listed alphabetically because they can't agree how else to answer them. The best way to look at this organization is if you took Coke and Pepsi and tried to bring them together in the same room and get them to agree on how to make soft drinks. Okay? This is what this organization is. In their early days, there were 2 representatives at every meeting. There were 10 people minimum. The person that was working with the council from the card brand and the card brand's attorneys. Okay? This is best described as a completely dysfunctional organization in its early days. The good news is they've improved dramatically. There is a lot of the staff now that are actually PCI employees rather than card brand employees. And we've seen a great transformation in that organization where they're actually starting to get things done. And we're actually starting to see better guidance every year. I worked on a document, the wireless guidelines, and I think from when we turned it in, it still took 18 months to get published. Things are getting better, but I just want to kind of set the stage. It's not a perfect picture there. It's key to understand, though, the PCI Council just sets the standards. It's up to the card brands then to enforce those standards. It's the card brands that assign penalties, fines. It's the card brands that set validation rules. So I mentioned there are multiple standards out there. Starting on the left there, it's an ecosystem here. So you start with the PCI PTS, or PIN Transaction Security Standards. So if you are a manufacturer making a terminal, like when you go to Target or Walmart or someplace that to check out, it's the standards by which those terminals are built. Or when you go to an ATM machine, it's that hardware technology. There's a set of standards those manufacturers have to adhere to and are tested to. You don't hear a lot about that standard because it's in a manufacturing area, but that's really where it starts. We then have the PCI PADSS. This is for payment applications. So if you are a software development company and you're building an application that is authorizing payments as part of an application, that application can be certified as a PADSS application. And then all of those standards fall in under the PCI DSS, and that's what most of you are familiar with. What was ground into me for a year was PCI is not PCI, it's one of these standards. And there are actually now more standards out, like the point-to-point encryption and so forth. So, that was just a quick level set, give you a little background on PCI and the different standards in the organizations. What I really came here today to talk about is why our organization's failing. I've given this talk a couple of times now. Every time I've given the talk, somebody's come up to me afterwards and said, we thought we were compliant, and now we understand we are not compliant. So hopefully none of you fall into that category, but I am 100% right now. So why do they fail? First and foremost, it's really hard, is my technical description. There are over 300 requirements and test procedures. The standard has improved every time it's been released, but it is still confusing. There are requirements that are very, very specific, but then you've got to figure out how they apply to your environment. And then there are requirements that are very, very generic, but you may not know what they actually do to meet them. So it's a combination of problems that you're dealing with. And if you're curious, the reason for that is the original standard has very many authors to it. So MasterCard took the logging section, I think it was, and Visa took, so different card brands did different sections and then they brought them together. And so that's why you see very specific requirements, like under key management, and then you see some very generic requirements in Section 7 around access control approval. They had different authors when they were built. And then organizations just don't really understand how to scope a PCI DSS assessment. And I am going to get into that, and I'm actually going to go through slides that look real similar to QSA training. I, of course, did not copy those because that would be a violation of the agreement I signed when I left the councils. They just look similar. And then what I see a lot of organizations, and I just finished an assessment with a company that was compliant a year ago, and I came back in and they were less than 50% compliant. And their problem was when they finished the project a year ago and we handed them their report on compliance, they stopped. They had a little party and then they stopped looking at PCI and went off to do other projects. They approached PCI as if it was a project, and they never got to the point of implementing it as a business as usual, day in, day out process. And that's really what hurt them. And they've had a lot of struggles. And unfortunately, it has been a revenue or a resume generating event for some folks. Also, companies believe that PCI makes them secure, and all of you as security professionals know that's not true. The PCI standard is intended to be the minimum standard, and it does not mean you are secure. It means you're compliant to the PCI DSS requirements, and it means you are compliant at the time of the assessment. The day your ROC is signed, you're compliant that day. That compliance is good for a year, but as you know, you're one change request away from disaster. And that's what's happened under some of these breaches, is changes have occurred, processes have not been maintained, and security problems have occurred. I don't know if you quite call Target a security problem, but and then finally, and this is the closest I can get to a sales pitch to you, companies believe the lowest price PCI assessment is the same as a higher price PCI assessment. And quite frankly, in the world of consulting and assessments, you get what you pay for. If one assessor is twice the price, they're probably going to do twice the work. The problem that you see sometimes is organizations will come in, they'll find one failure in a given area of the standard, and they'll stop looking because they figure, okay, well, you're not compliant to whatever it is, logging. You know, you're not doing logs off your, what was the one I ran into, your call recording system. Well, they don't go and look at the rest of the system. So you fix that, they write your compliance certificate, and you go on, and they fail to assess all the other systems. And then the next year somebody comes back and goes, oh, well, you're not compliant for logging for this database. Well, we were compliant last year. That was the excuse I heard on a regular occasion when I pointed out a flaw to somebody is, well, we were compliant last year. Well, that just means the guy last year didn't find it. It doesn't mean you were actually compliant last year. So good statistics, or bad statistics, I guess, depending on how you look at it. The Verizon PCI report that came out earlier this year. The gray is 2012, the red is 2013. The numbers across the bottom are the sections of the PCI standard and the compliance percentage. And you can get it, first of all, see, even in 2013, there's not a single one of those that are compliant. Now, their data here are organizations that they assessed after an event. So for some reason that they were asked to come in from an incident response standpoint, these were their findings. But you can see some common threads here. Section 11 is about the worst. That is all the security testing requirements, vulnerability scanning, pen testing, and so forth. Section 3 has always been a struggle. That's where we get into having to deal with data retention, masking, and protecting card data, usually through encryption and key management. But you can see we're improving year to year, but we're still not at a place where we're consistently compliant. And I'll get into some of those statistics in more detail later in the presentation. So the first section I wanted to get into is segmentation here. This is one of the confusing points I've seen over the years. Many organizations just don't understand what is proper segmentation, what really does meet the PCI's definition of segmentation. The first step there is you've got to understand your cardholder data environment. I'm going to go through some specific case study, specific training information that is used with the QSAs on how do you determine your cardholder data environment. But understand when we're talking segmentation, it's not a requirement. You don't have to segment. If you don't segment, your entire network scope is the key. And so for what a lot of people have done over the years is they've segmented their network down, they've drawn out a little box, they've given it some pretty name, as PCI Network Secure Zone, PCI Enclave, everybody has to name these things. I wish they put as much effort into actually securing them as they did naming them, but there's always some fancy name they give them. And that's great, but there's some really interesting problems in this area, and that's what I'm going to get into. First, though, we've got to talk about some common terminology here. When we talk about cardholder data, we're talking, the official name for it is primary account number. Everybody calls it a credit card number or card number. The name, the expiration date, and the service code. That is considered cardholder data. If you're curious, a service code is just a code that denotes what type of card it is. Is it a debit card? Is it a credit card? Etc. It is not the card validation code that's printed on the card. Then we get into sensitive authentication data. That is the full track data. That is the data on the magnetic stripe on the back. It is the full track read. There are actually 2 tracks on there. I will not bore you with the details of that. The reason this is an issue is if I get your track data, I can recreate your physical card. There's a problem going on right now out in California, and it's a result of the Home Depot breach, and there are fake credit cards that are being sold on the street out in California, which leads me to believe that Home Depot lost track data. That's not been confirmed yet, but there are fake credit cards being sold, and they're being tied back to the Home Depot breach. And the only way you can recreate a card is to have the full track. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Card validation code is that 3 or 4 digit card that's printed on there. That is also on the stripe. And then your PIN or PIN block. Those data types are called sensitive authentication data. And the reason they're separated is you can store cardholder data. You just have to secure it. You cannot store sensitive authentication data. So, these next couple bullet points come right from the PCI standard. It surprises me how many times I've had to read it to people and they've actually never seen them before. It says PCI DSS requirements apply to all system components included in or connected to the cardholder data environment. Meaning if a system is processing, transmitting, or storing cardholder data, it's part of the cardholder data environment, or if it's connected to the cardholder data environment, it is in scope. The cardholder data environment is comprised of people, processes, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data or sensitive authentication data. So this is what the PCI Council defines as the cardholder data environment. Some additional examples here, I'm not going to read that whole list, but it's really everything in your network is what it comes down to. Without segmentation, your entire network is in scope. Active Directory, time servers, NTP servers, DNS servers, network infrastructure, you name it, without segmentation, if you're taking credit card data on your network, your entire network's in scope. So, now you get to learn like a QSA learns. So here is a very simple network. It's an e-commerce network. As you might tell, there's a web server up at the top. That little red and blue thing is to denote credit cards. You may not be able to tell that. And we have a simple, what we would call flat network. No segmentation in place. With this scenario, because that is an e-commerce website, the firewall and the web server, the router, all of that is in scope. It is processing, it is transmitting cardholder data. The e-commerce server and the e-commerce database server are obviously in scope as well. They are processing cardholder data. The database server is storing cardholder data. The key thing to understand in this scenario is everything else is also in scope. There is no segmentation here, so your users, your laptops, anything physically plugged into the networks, network switches, you name it, it's in scope here because there is no segmentation. That one's pretty easy. Now we get into a segmented design. For those network architects in the room, don't pick on my segmentation. This drawing's actually a little old. I just didn't update it. But the idea here is we have a PCI LAN and we have a corporate LAN. Same scenario, e-commerce environment, we have a web server, so that is still in scope. Wherever the card number is passing through, being processed, those devices would be in scope. The e-commerce server and the database server is still obviously in scope. What a lot of people, though, at this point assume is everything is yellow, is in scope, and everything that's not in those yellow boxes is out of scope, and that's what they'll tell their QSAs to assess. The QSAs are supposed to follow the direction of the customer and then validate that. Let's just say not everyone validates that scope. If the customer says it's those 4 servers, that's what they're going to look at, that's where they go. In this scenario, though, what some people don't think about is, well, if I've got that e-commerce server and I've got that database server, somebody internally is obviously accessing that data. If they have access to that data, that card number is going across the network and it's being displayed on their desktops, on their laptops. And I'm not talking about they're downloading it, but they're accessing it. So through normal methods, we're passing a card number across that corporate network, which brings those workstations into scope. This is a problem. And so the council defines segmentation as isolating systems that process cardholder data from those that do not. I've got a client right now that built a very large PCI, they called it Enclave, but yet they had employees keying card numbers into a Windows application on desktops, and they did not consider that as being in scope. They're transmitting an unencrypted card number across the network. The network is in scope by the definition. I think most of you would probably agree to that. It's not that hard when you start looking at data flows. So that's the first problem you run into, really, is you're bringing your entire network into scope. Some of the things to think about in that, there's ways around that. go back to my drawing. If it's through a web session and over HTTPS and we're encrypting that card number over the wire, we can keep a corporate network out of scope that way. I've had a lot of luck with organizations using, say, Citrix or RDP or something like that. Just finished with a client that was going to move to using XenApp. That was their solution for that Windows desktop. We'll encrypt that session out to that workstation. The workstation is still going to be in scope because they're keying card numbers in it, but by encrypting the session from the workstation across the network, we can keep the network and its associated devices out of scope by doing that. So now I want to talk about storage of cardholder data. These things really tie together. First problem I see, organizations are storing card data when they don't need to store it. The best way to get through PCI easily is don't store card data in your organization. Some people have gotten the wrong information over the years. They think they need to store the card number after the transaction. They do not. Even if you need to research chargebacks, you don't need to keep the full card number to do that. You're allowed to actually keep the first 6 and last 4 digits. That is still not considered cardholder data. If I have the first 6 and last 4 and an authorization code and a person's name, I should be able to research that without any problem. And then most of my banks or processors today will have some sort of lookup capability where I can go see the full card number if I need it. The other thing that I've seen in a lot of organizations is they are storing cardholder data and they don't know it. And this is the worst scenario because if it's unknown storage, it's likely unsecured storage. Particularly log files, error logs, debug files, things like that. Many times web servers, database servers, application servers will write card numbers in logs. Software developers have gotten a lot better over the years because of PCI, and this is one of the areas I've seen direct changes in our industry because of the PCI standards, and it's through audit logs. You'll see older versions of software where they may be writing card numbers, and then once you upgrade them, the developers fix that. The other thing to think about is things like imaging servers or call recording servers. The last time I did this presentation, the lady that came up to me afterwards had validated compliance for 4 years in a row. And no one had thought about their call recording servers. They had a QSA on site for 4 years that never bothered asking, do you do call recording? They looked at the databases, they looked at the web servers, they looked at the applications. They never thought about the fact that their card numbers in call recordings. The PCI Council stance is cardholder data in any format. Images, call recordings, you name it. If it's a full card number, it's cardholder data. And this is an area that can be a problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to find it. The specific requirements we're dealing with here: do not store sensitive data after authorization. If it is received, you must be able to delete it securely. You need to review all your transaction logs, error logs, those types of things. And then if you are storing cardholder data after authorization, then they list it as render it unreadable. For a lot of organizations, that does mean encryption. So we're back to our little network here for our case study. So this is a little more expanded than what we saw before. But we've got our web server up top. We've got our e-commerce server. We've got our database server. What the client would tell me a lot of times in these scenarios is the card number comes into the web server, it goes to the e-commerce application server, and the card data is saved in the database server. That's the only place it's saved. And we may have another application that is pulling like sales data off of the e-commerce server. We may have an audit logging server there, but many times as a QSA I would hear the card number is only on this one server. What we would do is go through that environment. First of all, let's look at the web server. There's logs there. I have commonly found not only card numbers there, but card validation codes. Card numbers are easy to find. There's search tools out there to do it. Card validation codes are very difficult to find. In this particular case, I found it because the developer was nice enough to label it in the log. It said CC number equals, and it would write it. Then it would say CVC equals, and it would write it. But they were storing sensitive data, and they had years of logs on the web server in unencrypted ASCII format. The external-facing web server. Next place that you always look is that middle tier, that application server again, log files, debug, error logs, those types of things. You'll see card numbers, you'll see card validation codes. Then you need to start looking at data flows. If there's data being moved from one application to another, that's always an area you want to pay careful attention to. I had one very large retailer. Department A said, we're sending a file every night to Department B, and it has credit card numbers in it. I go to Department B, I said, so I understand you receive cardholder data from Department A. They said, no, we don't. So, well, they've told me they send you a file every night. Well, they send us a file, but it doesn't have card numbers in it. We only need this data out of it. I said, okay, well, let's go look at one of those files. Sure enough, the card number's in there. They said, well, I don't know why the card number's in there. We don't need it. They stored 2 weeks of every day, and this was a retailer that had thousands and thousands of stores. It was every credit card transaction for every day for 2 weeks that was sitting on a server somewhere, again, unencrypted, clear text. Database servers, always look at those. Audit log servers, there's particularly tricky requirements, says you must log all access to cardholder data. Some people will get a little overzealous with that, and they'll actually log that Jeff Foresman accessed that card number, and they'll log the card number. We don't need to know the card number, we just need to know that Jeff accessed the card number. File servers, user directories. Once found a laptop with a file on it that said Amex transactions last 90 days. You can guess what was in it. Users will download this data for seemingly weird and strange reasons, is the best description I can give you there. And then the user workstations themselves, my laptop example applying there. If you're going to give users access to databases that have card data on it, you better have good controls in place on what they're doing with that data. Or better yet, don't give them access to that data. And then email. Believe it or not, we still see a lot of organizations that have card numbers going through their email. Great place to put DLP to monitor for it. Yes, you will get emails from customers with credit card numbers in it. You do your best to train them, but no, that's not really something that should be a big problem with your compliance. We're looking for business processes here. Spreadsheets that are being emailed with card numbers in them. Users just don't think. To Ira's point, your awareness programs are not always effective. You still have to look at these email servers. I've had organizations that have said, well, we need to be able to do that. We want to be able to encrypt it. That's a really bad idea. Just don't send card numbers through email. Find some other way to do it. I talked earlier about reviewing logs. This is not an easy process. This is an actual log. You'll see it's back from 2010. This was an airline. This was a log off of a kiosk. And I did take the numbers out. The card numbers probably expired by now. But it was an interesting situation. The original version of the software, every time you went up and put a card into the reader, it would read your name and your card number and write it to their log. They knew that was bad, and so the developer fixed it and stopped writing the card number to the log. But you still have the ability with this airline to go in and if you couldn't find your reservation, a lot of the airlines will let you search by the card number you made the reservation with. They were logging the search string that went to them. And These are logs that had been on those kiosks since they had been installed. And you can imagine the traffic that those things get. Now, fortunately, not a lot of people search for their ticket by their card number. But again, clear text, unprotected. So you really want to be careful and look at these things. Now, there's a lot of automated tools out there to help this. A lot of vendors will talk to you about DLP tools that proactively will see it on the wire going across your network, that'll scan your shares. When you're doing these assessments, there's a number of tools out there. There's an old tool out there that still works called Spider that's free. It's designed by Cornell University. I use a tool called Identity Finder. It's a $40 or $50 tool. But they're very good at finding card numbers on systems. My tip, though, is take the logs off the production system and scan them. Just trust me, take them. I have a habit of taking things down, I found out. Like reservation systems. People seem to frown upon that. So, cardholder data storage, be careful. There's a lot of stuff out there that's being stored. People don't know about it. The next thing I want to talk about is vulnerability management. This is an interesting change in PCI version 3. I found it interesting. They have never renumbered a requirement from the standpoint of changing the order of requirements. In PCI version 2, 6.1 was patching, 6.2 was vulnerability management. In PCI DSS version 3, they flipped those two. And they did it purposely to try to emphasize the importance of vulnerability management over patching. Yes, you still have to patch. You're not going to get out of that one. But what they're trying to say is it's more important to identify the vulnerabilities when they're announced, to risk rank those vulnerabilities, and then to patch according to that risk ranking. Unfortunately, what I've seen over the years is a lot of an organization's patching process starts with their vulnerability scan. And they're not aware that something needs to be patched until the guy that runs their vulnerability scan says, we need to pass PCI this quarter and this stuff needs to be patched. That's not a vulnerability management program. So, what PCI says here is you must develop a vulnerability management program to identify the vulnerabilities using outside sources, assign a risk ranking, and notify appropriate IT staff for remediation. So you would subscribe to vendors alerts. CERT is a good one because it'll give you a consolidated list of vulnerability announcements. You can look at the vendor's risk ranking and you can accept that risk ranking, or you can reassign a risk ranking to it. So if it's a vulnerability that's not exposed to the internet, that is maybe in your PCI segmented network, for whatever reason, you can go through the process and decide, okay, this isn't a critical vulnerability to us for the following reasons. You do have to document it, that we're going to look at this as a medium or low risk. What that does is give you an extra 60 days. The 6.2 says you must be able to patch it within a month. I catch myself. It used to say 30 days, and then they changed it because somebody pointed out to the PCI Council that there's a few months that have 31 days in it. So it now says a month. If it's not a high critical vulnerability, you have 90 days to patch it. So there is what they're trying to do here is get you to react quickly to the patches you need to react to. So when Heartbleed comes out, that's not something you wait 30 days to patch, right? You got on top of that one right away. What they're trying to say is they want to give you the flexibility to react to the things that need to be addressed right away and push off those things that you've identified as being lower risk to your organization. The key thing is you have a risk management process and you're documenting those decisions. I talked quite a bit about this slide, sorry about that. The key thing, again, the last bullet point there, document it. Is it low, medium, high to your organization, and then patch appropriately. We'll talk a little bit more about the vulnerability scanning side of this next. So, security testing. This is the largest failure area according to the Verizon report. If you look at the very bottom of that, they measured 39% compliance in the organizations that they had visited after an event, likely a breach. I found this statistic interesting, though, because this is not an area where the standard is confusing. The standard is very clear. You are to scan on a regular basis, and I'll go through the next slide, all of the standards here. You're to scan after changes, but this is the lowest compliance area. It's because it's really difficult, and if any of you manage your vulnerability management programs, staying up on the scanning and patching cycle and hitting these time frames can be very, very difficult. So let me walk you through this. The first column there is internal vulnerability scanning. The second column there is external vulnerability scanning. You are required to have a compliant report on a quarterly basis or after significant changes. Let me define that a little bit better. The reason I said you're supposed to have a compliant report and not do vulnerability scans is, the reality is you'll do vulnerability scans much more often than quarterly to result in a quarterly report that passes. A passing scan for external is you cannot have anything with a CVSS score of 4.0 or higher. An internal scan, you cannot have anything with a critical or high vulnerability. So it's a little easier internally than it is external. The after significant changes is always an interesting situation. In the new version of PCI, in particular the ROC reporting template that the QSAs work with, it's been spelled out very clearly. My testing methodology is I'm supposed to go to your change control log, pick out significant changes in your network, applications, web, databases, whatever those things might be, and then come to you and say, prove to me that you did a vulnerability scan after this change. This was a requirement that in past, to be honest, when we tested it, we would ask the client, did you scan after significant changes? Sure we did. Okay. Because quite frankly, we were too busy trying to deal with all the other bigger problems. Nowadays, there's no flexibility for the QSAs. They must be able to prove that you've scanned after significant changes. So, I was waiting for someone to say, what's a significant change? Okay, there we go. I knew somebody would catch up. Thank you. You're in brownie coma right now, aren't you? Significant changes, the best answer I can give you to take off my QSA hat is you define what's a significant change. Now there's going to be some obvious things. I mean, if you put in an entire new application, new web-facing application, that's a significant change. That new application would need to be scanned. The key thing that I found over the years is you define what is a significant change in your policy and then follow that. QSAs are going to have a hard time challenging it unless it's just a stupid policy. Okay? There's also a requirement I'll talk about in a minute that you're supposed to do penetration tests after significant changes. So what I've typically done to help clients is we would define what types of changes require a vulnerability scan and what types of changes would require a pen test. The easy thing to do is if your configuration management process, your change management process, simply results in a vulnerability scan before any new system is deployed, you will by default meet this requirement. Now some of you in your environment think, oh, that's impossible. If you go back and look at the root of a lot of vulnerabilities, they're configuration problems when something was deployed. Scanning it before it goes in production as part of a standard process is the easiest way to meet this requirement, but in my opinion, a great leap forward in your security programs. No, I don't have funding to give you for the people to do it. Sorry. I know that's the next hurdle. Okay, so I want to touch on scope here. Internally, it's all internal IP addresses included in or connected to your cardholder data environment. So yes, if you have proper segmentation, you don't have to scan those things that are not in your PCI scope? Personally, I think you should. And this is going to continue to evolve in a PCI environment. It's going to continue to evolve with QSAs, because although we've been told that with proper segmentation something's out of scope, a lot of the assessors, because of the malware that's out there, are getting really uncomfortable saying, you know, these 5,000 desktops aren't in scope anymore. As of today, you would not have to do vulnerability scanning there. Externally, it's the same thing. Everything that is in the external cardholder data environment, or providing a path to the cardholder data environment. And I touch on that one because sometimes I'll see there's an internal network that's been segmented. Your border firewall, anything external facing still has to be scanned. Whoops. That was interesting. Sorry. Trash. All right, we're back. Let me get to that side. All right. So, penetration testing. Key takeaways here. You must do both network and application penetration testing, internal and external. Let me lay this out in chart format for you. The penetration tests are done annually or after significant changes. The scope would be the same scope as you have for vulnerability scanning. There's some confusion here. Penetration testing does not have to be done by an external party. They can be done internally. You will have to prove to your QSA, though, that the person doing it has the training to do it and that they have the independence to do it. So your firewall administrator cannot be doing your network pen test. Your web developer cannot be doing your web application pen test. But if your organization has enough of a staff to show independence and those people have received their proper training, you can do your pen testing internally. From a passing standpoint, essentially it's going to be the same rules as a vulnerability scan. You cannot have any externally the same rules. CVSS 4.0, if it's a web pen test, you can't have anything that's listed under the PCI requirement 6.5 section, which is basically the OWASP top 10 list. And then you've got to be able, under PCI 3.0 now, to document what your pen testing methodology is. So you would document internally what you expect your internal staff or your vendor to follow. What we're really looking for here is what industry standard pen testing methodology. And yes, I know there's not a lot of them that are truly industry standard right now, but this is something that will go into effect next July 1st, the documentation of what that is. A real quick case study here. This was a vulnerability scan that was external facing. This is quite common. You want to see this is actually one that was given to me. And the client thought it was compliant because there were no higher critical vulnerabilities on there. My first question, and yours should probably be, well, what's that critical thing? Unsupported Unix operating system. They said, well, it's not a vulnerability, it's just not supported anymore. I don't have to explain that to you guys, right? I mean, you get that. The other ones there, they are medium vulnerabilities, but if you look at the numbers next to them, they are higher than 4.0 on a CVSS scale. In particular, anytime you see SSL version 2, it's an automatic failure under the PCI guidelines for external vulnerability scanning. This gets a little better. Here's a scan, same customer internally. If you can't read that, that says all highs, and they go somewhere between 7.8 and 9.0 on their CVSS score. Their excuse was, well, this is all Cisco gear. Okay. Well, we don't patch that unless it breaks. Well, you're not compliant. Well, that's ridiculous. How do you expect us to patch our Cisco gear all the time? Well, why wouldn't you? Well, there's no vulnerabilities to that. Okay. This was just one of 200 findings I had, but I just wanted to show you some of the things that we as QSAs commonly see here. The next struggle point, and what I think is probably one of the hardest requirements to make, is audit logging. Audit logging in itself is not easy to do. It generates an enormous amount of data. Depending on what solution you're going to use to help you with this, it gets really expensive. There's some great solutions out there. I had a company recently deploy Splunk, well, beginning of the year, and they love Splunk, but now they're starting to look at, based on the number of events they're getting, what Splunk is going to cost them. They don't love Splunk so much now. It is, though, important. Many of the breaches, when I was with Verizon Business, was actually part of the team that responded to a number of major breaches. And then one of the key themes of most of those major breaches was a severe lack of audit logs. We really had a hard time figuring out what was going on. And if we didn't get there right when it happened, which was pretty much never, the logs, if there were there, had just rolled over. You look at something like Nevis Marcus and Home Depot, where the breach actually goes back 6 months, 9 months, a year. Those logs are long gone because they didn't have centralized logging solutions. So PCI says you must implement audit trails to link all access to system components to each individual user. And I emphasize each individual user very purposely, because some logs that systems generate don't give me what the user accessed and identifying the individual user. You must synchronize all system clocks. You must secure your audit trails. That's easy to do when you're using a SIM tool, not so easy to do when you're doing local logging on a lot of different systems. You must then review logs, and then you must retain those logs for at least 1 year. Here's the quick way to look at it. 10.2 tells you what to log, and you may or may not be able to read the details. There's a long list there. The two hard ones, and are also the most important. The first bullet point is all individual access to cardholder data. If you're going to store cardholder data, you've taken on a huge burden for audit logging. One of the reasons you don't want to store cardholder data, first of all, you have to log access to it. Second of all, you have to do encryption and key management. Under PCI is my technical description of pain in the ass. And then the second bullet point there, you must log all actions taken by an individual with root or administrative privileges. And they really do mean all actions. Everything an administrator does must be logged. And then the rest of this, you get into the common, the access control, failed login attempts, changes in privileges. One of my favorite, the creation and deletion of system level objects. Yes, that's tough to even figure out what is a system level object, much less how do I log it. The next step is what has to be in those logs. That's not usually too hard. What's supposed to be in there is usually in there. The hard stuff is the review. You must review logs on a daily basis. Not weekday, daily basis. That means 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And you must essentially review everything that was listed in 10.2. So you must actually review who accessed cardholder data. What did the administrators do? Yes, it sounds kind of crazy. It means you have to have a tool to automate that process. And even then, some of the tools that are out there aren't real good. You know, there's some SIM tools out there that have their PCI packages that give you these pretty dashboards with lights. Vendors like red, green, and yellow, right? The problem is those dashboards aren't reviewing the logs. If there's not some sort of correlation or alerting going on there, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've got the right rules in place to identify when there's malicious activity that happens. And this is very difficult to do. The next thing I want to talk about, and I'll wrap this up here in just a couple minutes, firewall rules. This is the next thing that a lot of people seem to fail. Target, Neiman Marcus, Home Depot, all of these things where we've had breaches. Everyone tends to focus on how did the bad guys get in? I always wonder, how did they get the data out? Because according to the firewall rules, and I'm going to go to this chart, they shouldn't be able to. You must restrict inbound and outbound access to what's necessary for the cardholder data environment. And then you must deny other traffic. You must limit inbound traffic to the DMZ. Essentially, you cannot have traffic going from the internet to the cardholder data environment or from the cardholder data environment to the internet. What you saw in Target was 10 gigabytes of data being FTP'd to Russia. Now, I realize that they have other systems in their environment and probably outside their cardholder data environment. But most organizations are very good at having rules for inbound traffic. Very few organizations have good rules for outbound traffic. You must have rules for outbound traffic to be able to pass PCI. What's good for you if you've passed PCI and your rules are questionable, most QSAs don't know how to read firewall rules. No offense to any QSAs in the room. I don't do it manually anymore. I have a tool to help me do it. But it's hard to read firewall rules. So the last couple of things I'll touch on and then we'll wrap up. This is kind of a catch-all. Configuration standards are another area that's weak. I see well-written configuration standards that nobody ever follows. If you're going to have configuration standards, you do need to be able to follow them. Under PCI 3.0, there'll be more scrutiny now paid to making sure organizations are actually implementing what their configuration standards say. Software development is a struggle. It is largely based on the OWASP Top 10. That means you've got to have some tools in place if you're developing web applications that are in scope for PCI to test for those vulnerabilities. You must train your developers on those vulnerabilities. The OWASP Top 10 is or the OWASP site is an excellent source for that. And the best tip I can give you here is put those vulnerabilities, web application vulnerability scanning tools in the hands of developers. File integrity monitoring has been difficult for a lot of organizations over the years. There's a lot of confusion around that. The best thing to understand is you must deploy it on all servers that store, process, and transmit cardholder data. I intentionally said servers. There are unfortunately some people out there that think it needs to be deployed everywhere in the cardholder data environment. That is not true. It never has been true. It's just there's a lot of confusion on how that requirement's been written. And finally, security awareness training. A lot of organizations are very good at training new employees. Under PCI, you must train all employees every year. You must keep a record of that, and it needs to be training on threats and vulnerabilities to your cardholder data, as well as your policies and procedures. So, any questions? Yes, sir?
What tool do you use for your ACO?
I use Nipper. Yeah. It's good for consulting, and there's also, you've got tools out there like Firemon, Too Thin, I always forget the name of the other one, Red Seal. They're good for managing firewalls that will also do those rules reviews.
Another question is, your slides on segmentation, you had a bullet point on VMs.
Yeah.
I have one VM server that handles cardholder data. Doesn't that treat it like it's on the same segment?
That simple sounding question opens up an enormous can of worms. Yeah. So the simple answer, then I'll give you the more complicated answer. The simple answer to that one is you can segment that. Your hypervisor is always going to be in scope, obviously, because it's managing it. Here's the complicated answer. There's about 50-50 split in QSAs, or what I can roughly estimate, on their view of whether you need separate physical hosts or whether it's okay to segment within a physical host. And it's an unfortunate part of our industry right now. The council has come out on guidance with virtualization, but the guidance isn't clear enough to sway those people. There is one of the major QSA companies will not sign off on a ROC unless you have separate physical hosts. in a segmentation environment. I, on the other hand, I will, but I'll look very closely at how that's being managed, the hypervisor, all the management, the logging of it, all of those things will be in scope. Yes, sir?
Along those same lines, if you use the description of different data stores, would that, in your opinion, meet the segmentation requirements?
You said encryption? Encryption?
The data stores are two on the same device.
Two different keys on the same device. I would have to look at it in more detail. I don't think I'd have a problem with it, but I have to look at it. Anyone else? Yeah? Good question. And the council actually wrote a white paper on it. It's out on their website. They define it quite simply, and I don't know if I would break it down this easily, is a penetration test includes validation of the vulnerability scan and manual testing. I think there's a larger answer to that. And now with the 3.0, it actually says you have to document your pen testing methodology. It's supposed to be based on an industry standard. So I think in the future that's probably going to be the better answer. But there is a white paper out there that defines it different because there's a lot of ASVs. Those are the folks that are authorized to do vulnerability scans that were telling people at one point that their vulnerability scan wasn't contained.
I was going to say that the big difference between a pen test and a scan, a vulnerability scan, is the price.
Yeah, price. Well, that was part of the problem is people thought, well, all just my ASV is doing and I don't need to pay extra.
I have a question though. Which companies will not approve segmentation within the same hypervisor?
I'll answer that offline. I don't know all of them. I just know one of them in particular. Because I had a friend of mine that called me and said, hey, our QSA is telling us we need to split into physical host, and we're looking at, it's like $1.3 million. What do we do? I said, get it to QSA. Sorry, it's cheaper than buying multiple hosts.
Yeah, why won't they provide better guidance on that if it's split 50-50? Is there a feedback mechanism?
Remember my Coke and Pepsi analogy? That's my short answer.
Okay.
When I was with the council and I put those drawings together, at one point I had an AD server in there. There's no AD server listed there now because there was a week-long argument on whether the AD server had to be in the segmented network or if it was okay that it was outside. MasterCard said it's okay if it's outside. Visa said no, it has to be inside it. So there is no AD server on the drawing.
I'm well aware of that discussion as well.
Yeah. All right. I'm probably out. Oh, take one more. Yeah. Good question. Not defined. It's one of those, as a QSA, you know it when you see it. You know, if it was a week or two and there was a process defined that you were going through, if it was 3 months later, you said, oh, well, that's our quarterly scan, that's not really after significant changes. It all ties back to the policy, though, right? What's the policy? What's the procedure that you're going to follow? Okay, this is the last one, because he's standing up here, I think, getting me off.
Credit card data.
Yeah.
Is it required, or do you feel like it's going to be required to have multi-factor authentication?
So his question is it going to be required to have multi-factor authentication? Make sure my email address comes up here so you can see it. Today, the only place you have to have multi-factor authentication is for remote access. What gets interesting is when you do segmentation, and how you do segmentation. So I have clients that have a very small PCI environment, and they actually have two-factor authentication to get into their PCI environment so they can take their corporate network out of scope. And we literally take their corporate, they're a software developer, and we had to take their corporate network out of scope because they refused to wear employee badges. It goes against their culture. So we have two-factor authentication on their segmented environment, so we take their corporate environment. So we're saying corporate is untrusted. But at this point, as far as like a normal user sitting in your building, I have not seen any indication that they're going to force two-factor to that. Because if you look at the breaches, Most of the breaches are still happening because of malware. Now, Target with the whole vendor thing may change that a little bit, but there is a requirement already that says vendor accounts must be disabled when not in use and monitored when they are in use. So that requirement obviously failed for Target. So, okay, I think I'll wrap it up there. If you have any questions, I'll be around for a little while. I was trying to get my slide to come back up here. If you also, my name's Jeff Foresman. It's F-O-R-E-S-M-A-N. My email is jeff.foresman@rookssecurity.com. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.